Welcome everyone to our update of the Utstein out-of-hospital cardiac arrest template. Pleased to see so many people interested in this webinar that we're hosting to go over basically the changes that were made in this recent update. So I'm Professor Janet Bray. I'm going to be chairing this session along with the Utstein co-chair, John Thorsten Gressner, who will be speaking shortly about the history of the Utstein template, and then we will launch straight into the changes that were made. We'll have a Q&A session at the end if we have time. If we don't have time, however, we will take your questions and put together some responses and email them out to the wider group. So let's get started. JT, I will hand over to you to tell us about the history, please.
Janet, thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to share the session together with you and to have all the nice and interesting speakers here. I always feel a little bit old when I was asked to be talking about the history, so I thought normally this is one for the really old ones, but okay, it is like it is. My name is Jan Thorsten Gressner. I'm the director of the Institute of Emergency Medicine at the University Hospital in Schleswig-Holstein, and had the honor to share with Janet, the co-chair, the latest Utstein update. And when we talk about the latest Utstein update, we must be more specific. When we talk about Utstein, then we mean the Utstein recommendations for uniform reporting of data from out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, the Utstein style, as the old guys said in the 1991. This was the first time when we got a combined and discussed paper with definitions. What is a cardiac arrest, and what are the treatment and what is the outcome on cardiac arrest? And it's very important because in the years before that, a lot of people thought about, okay, this is cardiac arrest, that is cardiac arrest, this is a treatment, that is a treatment. And then it's very easy to analyze your own data, but it's very complicated or impossible to collect data and combine them international and learn from each other. So in 1991, it was the first one. At Utstein Abbey, you can see the picture, and this is the reason why it's called the Utstein recommendation. And there were many other conferences at Utstein and Utstein recommendation, but today we focus on out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, and there are others for in-hospital and so on. In 2004, the next generation of networkers, so 13 years later, sat together and discussed, is there a need for an update? And of course, there's always a need for an update, because new treatments, new ideas how to treat patients in cardiac arrest and how to analyze new tools. And this is the reason why Utstein is so important. The Utstein recommendation is a really good backbone for doing research without doing maybe randomized controlled trials. And we will hear Gavin and others today that are very familiar with this randomized controlled trials, but registries, and this will be the next step for the 15 update, registries are coming up more and more during the last 20 or 25 years. So we are aware worldwide about cardiac arrest and resuscitation registry. Our initiative with Global Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest Network is exactly that. We are talking about registry work within the other systems. So Asia is talking with the States, with Europe, with New Zealand, with Canada, with China. And so it's very important that we not only have a recommendation for scientific analysis, but we have also recommendation how we can collect data in a registry. So in 2015, the next group of authors included also people from registries. And the idea was, it's important to have the right variables, it's important to have the right and clear definitions, but it's also important to get this data into registries that we are able to collect hundreds of thousands of data worldwide and use them for analysis. And this is after 1991, 4 and 15. Now, next slide. Time for the latest update. And we are really happy that it's an ILCOR project. So it describes that it's an international collaboration. It's not only an idea of 20 or what we have authors that had nice ideas. It's ILCOR. So it's on the highest level what we can reach for recommendation. It's published in Circulation and Resuscitation at the same time. So you can see really with that list of authors on that list that we have included people and experts from all over the world. And some of them are here. And we're talking about the 2024 update and end of history. Now it's, that's what we have at the moment. best update what we ever had. This is what you normally said after Olympic Games, the best games ever. We are really sure that we have the best Utstein definition at the moment, but to be honest, before I hand it over to the next speaker, it's always a compromise. So we try to combine as many or integrate as many information what we can get, but we always think about collecting and how people can collect that data. And this is the reason why it is a compromise. There was some fights, there was a lot of discussion, but it was for us as the authors a really good time to get back to the basic things of registry work and scientific work. And this is what we have, the Utstein 2024. And I say thank you that you are all here listening to us, more than 170 people are in that Zoom. And Janet, this was history. Now it's now time. What have we in the next slide?
Thanks, JT. So I'm just going to very quickly run through how we went about this process. So we put together a writing group. We considered this very carefully, who we would want to be part of this update. We included some previous authors because they had the history of the 2015 Utstein, as well as earlier ones. We wanted to include some new registry leaders and early career researchers in the process. We also were careful about diversity, and we wanted representation from low resource settings. We predefined consensus, and that is, you can read about that in the Utstein update. To start with, we examined the use of the 2015 Utstein. We looked at all of the citations that used it in terms of research, and we also looked at some of the registry annual reports so that we could see how the data was being used and whether it was actually being used, each variable. And we collated all of that information, and we also surveyed the writing group on the 2015 items and decided what needed to be reviewed. And we also, at that point, identified any new items that we would want to include. We presented all of this information to the writing group and went through all of it in quite detail. We decided to retain the 5 domains that were used in the 2015 Utstein, and as well as having core and supplementary data. Some of the supplementary data is very important for research projects. And we divided the process component up into intra-arrest and post-arrest, as you'll see. We then broke up into 5 working groups, and people could join as many groups as they wanted. And we went through each of the items that were in the existing 2015, the ones that we decided in that survey that we needed to review. We came up with some new items as well as revisions to existing definitions and the data coding. And then we presented all of that work to the larger group. We then went through a process of surveys of the writing group, and this was all done anonymously for the changes and additions until we reached consensus on the new definitions and coding. And that makes it all sound very simple. It was a little bit more complicated than that. We did have some last minute changes that we did have to get consensus on because some of the wording wasn't quite right. But it was, and I'd just like to thank the writing group. They put up with a lot of emails and a lot of meetings at inconvenient times. So thank you. And as I said, the more detailed methods are provided in the document itself. So we did retain the 5 domains, as I said. And you can see that we modified quite a lot, but we wanted to do this in a way that it wouldn't have too many ramifications retrospectively for registries, but we also needed to change some things so that we could move forward. And as you can see here, we added 1 core item and 13 supplementary, and we added some details to some of the definitions that we thought were in need. We dropped 5 items. 4 items were moved to the system description rather than being a data collection point. And that was things like what oxygenation is used in an ambulance service and those sorts of things. We moved 1 item from supplementary to core, and all of this is detailed in the supplementary. We give a nice comparison to the 2015 update. and what was actually changed. So you can see all of that there. So what we're going to do next is to just go through some of the changes that we did make. We provided a minimum data set for low resource settings, and these are the factors that we know that predicts outcomes for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. I'm just going to quickly touch on this because this impacts a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. With the introduction of alerted bystanders, so people using things like Good Sam, we thought it important to define what exactly a bystander is, and to have these separate codes for the different responders to an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, because it is critical that we monitor this in systems. So we wanted to break it up into bystanders who are present at the scene, volunteer community responders who are alerted but are under no obligation to attend, first responders who are dispatched but don't have the capacity to actually transport a patient to hospital, and then EMS who are dispatched and have the ability to transport the patient. So when we're talking about these, as we go through some of the definitions, that's what we're talking about there. So I'm going to hand over to Judith now, who's going to present the key definitions for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest and EMS resuscitated, and then go through the dispatcher variables. Thank you, Judith.
Hi, my name's Judith Fenn. I'm a professor at Curtin University in Perth in Western Australia. And I must admit, I was in the 2004 and the 2015. So I'm with you, JT, there with the acknowledging the history. So first of all, there were some definitions that had changed slightly. So first of all, what is an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest? And obviously, it's defined by absence of signs of circulation, as assessed or confirmed by EMS. So this is not just a bystander saying that someone that they think's had a cardiac arrest, and but by the time EMS gets there, they're wide awake. The only occasion where that would be the case would be if the patient was awake following confirmed defibrillation. So they'd actually had a shock delivered by an AED before the EMS arrived. So this was just to clarify that point, and a recognition of how important these AED bystander shocked patients are, because they're actually in many services some of our best survivors. So that's recognised now that they should be included because they represent how the system is performing. EMS attempted resuscitation has been clarified that it has to be an actual dispatched responder, someone with a expectation to attend, and they've performed chest compression, defibrillation, or other related emergency care, in recognition that sometimes trauma occurs do not have necessarily CPR performed. And once again, all where a confirmed defibrillation has occurred before EMS arrived. And a recommendation that if registries include other emergency care amongst their attempted resus group, they should describe how it was defined in the system description. Next slide, Jenna. Increasing importance on dispatchers. We know that early CPR is reliant on a dispatcher, as is early dispatch of the ambulance to get to the scene. So that's now included. Whether the dispatcher recognised that it was an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, at this point, it's still only yes, no, unknown, or not recorded. There's some of us who believe that we need to go further than that next time, and perhaps include whether it was early in the call or not. Janet, you've jumped me. You've moved on. But at this point in time, it's just a yes, no. And also whether the dispatcher gave CPR instructions, yes, no, etc. And there's some suggestions there for additional supplementary material. Next one, Jenna, please. And then there's some, these are some supplementary variables that can be included. time to dispatcher recognition, as I said, is important, and it's about where you take time zero. The recommendation here is that it's when the call is answered by the EMS agency or a secondary public safety answering point. And I think in a lot of countries, the emergency call goes for a generic fire, police, and ambulance, and then based on what the caller says, it's transferred to, in this case, the EMS agency, the ambulance service, for dealing with their. So the gold standard is to go from the call answered by EMS agency up to the time the dispatcher identifies the cardiac arrest. That's the recommended time period. But it's recognised that that may not be possible to get, and so there's some other suggested time point ones that can be included there. Also, it would be, if possible, nice to collect information about whether a volunteer community responder was alerted, yes, no, and also whether the volunteer community responders accepted the alert. But as Janet said, we recognise that there's different stages of evolution in data capture in different ambulance services around the world, and the supplementary data recognises that we acknowledge that not everybody will be able to collect all of these variables. Next slide.
Hey, Marcus.
Yep, and thanks, Judy. So I'm going to take over. Marcus Ong here from Singapore, and I'll be covering the patient call and the intra-arrest variables. So I think as Janet has mentioned, the definition of bystander is going to be a key change that everyone needs to take note of. And we have clarified, you can see here compared to 2015, the bystander response to actually include both bystander CPR and bystander AED use. So these are actually subdivided into two kind of different categories. And if you look at bystander CPR, remember that this, by definition, is someone who is not dispatched by the system. So just to give an example from my system, this would mean that someone like a firefighter or police who has a duty of care and is activated by the dispatch center as a first responder would not qualify as a bystander. However, someone that is off-duty healthcare professional, for example, or a volunteer on an app like My Responder in my system or GoodSam would qualify as a bystander according to this definition. And so it is a yes, no, unknown, or not recorded options. And then supplemental, we actually go deeper into was there compression only, compressions and ventilation, or unknown, not recorded, or no bystander CPR. And likewise for AED, so this is referring to an AED applied by a bystander. And so was the AED kind of used, a shock delivered? Was it applied but no shock delivered? And again, there may be some situations where it's not known whether a shock was delivered or not. So there's a bit more clarity in the options. Next slide, please. Okay, and another big point that I want to spend a bit of time on is this idea of presumed cause. So in the 2015, the word pathogenesis was used, which we recognize not many people may understand what this refers to. So here we are clarifying that we are talking about the presumed cause of the cardiac arrest. And then this is defined into subgroups of medical, traumatic, drug overdose, drowning, asphyxia, electrocution, or unknown. And again, there is more explanation in terms of the data options, where medical includes both presumed cardiac, respiratory, terminal illness, anaphylaxis, SIDS, or sudden infant death, etc. Whereas trauma is defined as penetrating, blunt, or burns. Okay, and likewise, you can see there's some further explanation regarding asphyxia, which includes hanging, foreign body, suffocation, or strangulation. So the idea is that these should be collected from the same source that is documented. So in other words, if this is based on the EMS diagnosis, it should be consistently from the EMS diagnosis. And then we hope by giving a bit more clarity in terms of the subgroupings, that there can be a bit more clarity in defining the medical, traumatic, etc. categories. Next slide, please. Okay, and there are two new kind of variables here, which are CPR first and defibrillated first. And this is referring to who was the person who first provided CPR and who provided the first defibrillation. So this was previously not actually captured in the 2015 template. And so you can see, for example, there are options for bystander, the activated community responder, the dispatch first responder. Remember, this refers to usually uniformed personnel like police or fire, EMS, and others, as you can see. Next slide, please. Okay, we come to the response times and time intervals. And so one thing to emphasize is that in the 2024, we recognize that these are actually intervals rather than a single time point. So basically, an interval is between time point number 1 and time point number 2. And so the challenge comes in that many systems actually use different time point number 1 and possibly different time point number 2s. And so what we have tried to do with this new template is to actually elaborate more on what exactly is the time point that you are using for this interval. So let's take, for example, response time. And Judith had mentioned previously that what is recommended is actually to take the time that a call connects to the primary public service answering point. The Americans call the primary PSAP. So usually, for example, in the US system, that's 911, the time that a call connects to 911. However, sorry, Janet, just keep to the same slide. We recognize that in many systems, we are not able to capture the timing of the primary PSAP. That's because, for example, the medical call center may not actually be co-located with the 911 center, for example, and you don't have access to that data. So then there are other timings which, for example, are related to the secondary PSAP, which you can use as a substitute, but then you need to actually define that and be clear which variable you're using. And so likewise for time response, time point 2, most of the time we recommend that it should be the wheel stop turning and EMS arrives at scene. However, again, some systems have the ability to capture time that the EMS arrives at the patient side, which is actually probably a better true reflection of the response time. So, and that explains why that there are those options there. So likewise, a similar principle applies to time to first defibrillation, which you can see is defined as time point 1 and time point 2. Next slide. Okay, and then the same principle applies to time to first compression. And I guess the main difference here is that the first compression would be delivered by a variety of personnel depending on the previous variable, which we've explained, whether that's a bystander, volunteer, first responder, or EMS response, etc. Next slide.
Sherlyn.
Hi, then it's on to me. Thanks, Janet. Thanks, Marcus. So I'm Sherlyn from Singapore, and I'll bring you through the post-resuscitation care, focusing on just the core elements first. So the definitions and the coding of some of these elements have been updated to reflect the changes in the treatment recommendations, as well as to align ourselves with the 2019 in-hospital cardiac arrest Utstein template. So you can see that top of the list is the presence of STEMI, and this was previously in patient domain, and now we've moved it to post-resuscitation core. And the data options are such: yes, no, unknown, and not recorded. We have retained coronary angiography as well as reperfusion attempted, but what's different is that we now split into 2 variables, again to align with the 2019 in-hospital cardiac arrest Utstein template. And the timings have been redefined. So we redefined it as intra-arrest, urgent, which is within 6 hours of cardiac arrest, delayed, which is after 6 hours, but during the same hospital admission, and then no angiography, unknown or not recorded. The date and the time of the coronary angiography and reperfusion are now supplemental. And the last element, which is hospital type, it is to reflect whether or not there was a transport to a specialty hospital. In the adults would be a hospital that's capable of 24/7 coronary reperfusion. And in pediatrics, it is a hospital with a pediatric ICU. And this is because there is growing evidence that transportation to some of these specialty hospitals can be associated with improved outcomes. Although we recognize that, this may be limited to specific patient groups and in certain healthcare settings. When it comes to the supplemental elements, we have made some changes compared to the 2015 Utstein template, and that's all largely to align with the 2019 in-hospital Utstein template as well as the updated ILCOR treatment recommendations. So for example, we have removed single measurements such as pH, lactate glucose, because we feel that single measurements are limited in value. We have also removed some treatment parameters like blood pressure, oxygenation, and ventilation because treatment targets can vary over time. And I think that's on to the next slide.
Thank you, Shirlene. And Jerry Nolan couldn't make it today. So Shirlene, thank you for stepping in. Gavin, you're up.
Yeah, great, thank you. So I'm doing the section on outcomes, and I guess this slide is to emphasize that the outcomes section, as with the 2015 version, heavily draws upon the work from the core outcomes set for cardiac arrest clinical trials led by Kirsty Hayward and the subsequent PCOSCA, or the pediatric equivalent that was published a short time ago. If we go forward to the next slide, this is to note that I think outcomes was the one section that did get an upgrade. So the outcome of transport to hospital was upgraded from a supplemental to a core item, reflecting the significant resource implications and variation in practice that occurs in relation to where resuscitation is started and stopped. If we move to the next slide. So looking through the remaining core outcomes, those remained the same. There was no significant changes, but there was some minor modifications reflecting changes in the field. And if we look at survived event that has been defined over a number of iterations of Utstein for ROS sustained until arrival at the emergency department and transfer of care to medical staff at the receiving hospital. If return of circulation, so in other words, the application of ECPR had been started, that there would be an outcome that would reflect the fact that somebody was on ECPR at the point of admission to hospital. So you can see in bold there, yes, ROSC was the previous definition, but we now have an option to include return of circulation. There was a lot of discussion amongst the group as to whether we should introduce a particular time period in the in-hospital, given that there's not a point of transition between care settings. Timing of 20 minutes is used, but it was felt from the out-of-hospital perspective that we should retain survived events around that transition of care. If we can move to the next slide. Again, no substantive changes to the definitions for survival to discharge or 30 days, or neurological outcome at discharge or 30 days, but some points of clarification. So for survival to discharge, if the person is transported to another hospital for treatment and the outcome is unknown, that would not reflect a survival to hospital discharge from the first hospital. It should be recorded as unknown because indeed the outcome is unknown. For neurological outcome, the options of including CPC or modified Rankin remains the same. but the introduction cognizant of the pediatric COSCA work that the PEDS QL scales should be used at hospital discharge or 30 days. The paper again suggests that when reporting outcomes, one shouldn't pool survival to discharge with survival to 30 days, that they should present them separately because those rates may vary when you move between different health systems. If we move to the next slide, these are now moving into the supplemental outcomes. There are some new outcomes, seen outcomes. So this is what was the state of the patient's condition at the point that the emergency services left the scene, with ROSC, CPR in progress, deceased unknown or not recorded. The hospital arrival outcome again is whether CPR is in progress, whether ROSC has occurred, whether the person's died, whether they weren't transported unknown or not recorded. Treatment withdrawal remains unchanged from previously. Cause of death has moved to context of death, and if you move over to the far right of the bottom part of the slide, that this is in relation to what was the mechanism through which the person died. Was it termination of resuscitation efforts? Was it rearrest with a do not attempt resuscitation? Was it withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments for either a neurological or non-neurological position? Were there other reasons? Is it unknown or not recorded? Move to the next slide, please. Date and time of death has been added as a supplemental outcome that will allow the longer term tracking of patients' survival and quality of life. Again, we don't specify within its specific time points at which an individual should be followed up to assess their health-related quality of life, but suggests that potentially it's sampled over a number of occasions, depending on resources that are available. We stuck with HUE3, SF36 and EQ5D5L for adults, and the introduction of the PEDS QL scales for children. That wraps up my presentation. I think we can move to the next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. Hello, everybody. My name is Ziad Nemi. I'm the Director of Research and Evaluation. It's a pleasure to join you tonight. I'm joining you from Melbourne in Australia. So I think many of you, as you're looking at this slide, will be very familiar with the Utstein templates or the patient selection flowcharts that were quite common in the previous iterations. In fact, you can see on the left-hand side the 2004 version and the 2015 version on the right-hand side. In fact, there's one more version that perhaps is even more common than these two, and that was the original 1991 version, which isn't pictured here. But one thing that we learned very quickly when we reviewed the international literature, particularly reports that cited previous Utstein templates, was that these figures weren't commonly used. And in particular, the 2015 figure that you see on the right-hand side on your screen wasn't very commonly used in cardiac arrest outcome reports. And we think that's probably for a variety of reasons. But one of the two key reasons is that the templates for that flowchart weren't readily available. And of course, it was a very in-depth detail of cardiac arrest characteristics and outcomes across that figure. And we think that that made it somewhat difficult for people to be able to adopt and embed in their publications when they're providing Utstein outcome style reports. And so we had a very deep discussion about what this could look like. And the focus was to try and simplify this by providing the core characteristics and outcome variables as part of the Utstein template or flowcharts. And as we have done previously with the Utstein templates that are focused both on system effectiveness and system efficacy, we aim to achieve exactly the same thing, but in a much more simplified version. Thanks, Janet. And so the flowchart you're looking at now is the revised system effectiveness flowchart. This is the flowchart that we would expect that you would use to depict all patients that receive an EMS attempted resuscitation. There are 4 key elements that we want you to detail in these flowcharts: the population served, the cardiac arrest treated population, the population characteristics, and the patient outcomes. So you can very see at the top of that flowchart that we want you to detail the number of the population or the serviceable population served by your EMS. The cardiac arrest treated, we want you to detail the number of cardiac arrests that receive an attempted resuscitation. If patients are not resuscitated by the EMS, we want you to detail why in the box to the right-hand side. As you're moving down the screen, you're looking at population characteristics. We want you to detail, in terms of the recommended detail, we want you to detail things such as sex, initial shockable rhythm, medical etiology, witnessed by bystander or EMS, bystander CPR, and public location. Importantly, if you've got missing or unknown detail with each of those variables, we want you to report that in the brackets next to each of those bits of detail. And then finally, we want you to report patient outcomes. And our recommended detail for patient outcomes is any return to spontaneous circulation, survived event, survived to hospital discharge or 30 days, and then favourable neurological outcome at discharge as it's been collected in your registry or system. Thanks, Janet. And so the second version of this looks at system efficacy, and this is how we would recommend that you report the Utstein comparator group. This is the group that is bystander witnessed and is in an initial shockable rhythm. And so this is the group that is typically being used to benchmark survival outcomes globally. And again, the four key elements remain the same. And in this particular flowchart, we provide additional detail by providing the witness status into the bystander witness population and into initial shockable rhythms. But all of the other detail remains relatively the same. Now, what we've also done is provided you with templates with both publications in resuscitation and circulation, provided you with templates on these two flowcharts. So you can download these templates and adjust them for your own Utstein style outcome reports or research publications. We also recognise that you might need to make some adjustments or amendments to these templates depending on which population that you're looking at. So adults versus children, EMS witnessed versus not EMS witnessed, and potentially trauma versus non-traumatic or medical and non-medical patients as well. And we recognise that that is something that you will do. But we think that by providing you with these templates, we might actually see a greater adoption of these flowcharts in Utstein style outcome reports. Thanks, Janet. And then finally, just as you would adopt a reporting checklist for a study design, whether it be an observational study design or a randomised control trial, we also see the importance of being transparent and consistent in the way that we report our EMS systems and our data collection methods. And so to try and reduce variability in the reporting of these methods, we've adopted a checklist. This is not a new checklist. This is a checklist that was also provided in the 2015 version of the Utstein template. We have also made some revisions to that checklist and provided this in the supplementary appendix for you all to use. So we would expect that you would adopt a reporting checklist according to the study design, whether that be strobe for observational studies or a different reporting checklist depending on the study design. But in addition to that, if you're reporting on an Utstein style outcome report, we also hope that you will use this checklist, which provides you with some clear advice around detailing elements within the title, abstract, the methods, the results, and the discussion. And this ensures that Utstein outcome reports all consistently report the same things globally. And that brings me to the end of my session. So I'll hand back to you, Janet. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Zee. And thank you to all the presenters. That was excellent. And we have included in the supplementary of the publications the templates and the checklist in a Word form so that you can use that for any reporting and uploading with manuscripts for research. So I'm just going to stop sharing in a minute, but I would just like to acknowledge all of these incredible people who gave up a lot of their time over an 18-month period to put this together, and I think what we've come up with is practical as well as refined, and you know, some of these people are registry leaders in the world, and and have the expertise that was needed. So thank you. So we've got 20 minutes now for some questions. Sorry, I couldn't look at the questions while I was sharing my screen. So we have a couple of questions by the looks of things in both the Q&A and in the chat. Just having a quick look, sorry. If you do have a question, please put it in the...
So Janet, while you're, maybe reading, because I answered one of the questions, which was how would you register someone who had return of circulation on hospital arrival or leaving the scene? In other words, they were receiving pre-hospital ECMO. We've had a discussion amongst the panel, and we purposefully included return of circulation only in the survived event definition. And so if you're in the process of putting someone on eCPR upon leaving the scene, that you should record as CPR in progress. Similarly, the hospital outcome event, it's the survived event component that variable was added. Thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. So we've got a question from Steve Faddy. Have you clarified the definition of the Utstein comparator group? Oh, sorry. I think, see, it's answered it. Z, do you want to respond to that verbally?
Yes, I'm very happy to respond. So it's the bystander witnessed cohort with an initial shockable rhythm that receives an attempted resuscitation by EMS. And there's a very clear description that's provided in the publication.
The Australians are awake. Jason Belcher has a question. Can you clarify signs of life as a reason for not attempting resuscitation in these templates? I assume this means it was determined by the EMS the patient was not in cardiac arrest.
Yeah, correct, Janet. And I think that was an element that was also part of the previous Utstein flowchart, signs of life, intended to identify the number of patients where EMS did not consider resuscitation because the person had signs of circulation.
Okay.
Yep, and Marcus here, I can take the next question from Olivier, which is referring to turnout and curb to care kind of intervals. And so I think the Utstein group recognized the problem with, defining response time, because everyone uses different time points, which is why the new template now actually makes you specify what is time point number 1 and time point number 2. So ideally, what we recommend is for you to capture the time the call comes in to the primary PSAP, which is the primary public service answering point. And so basically, this is the first point of contact with the actual emergency system. And then what most people capture for time point 2 is actually time the wheels stop turning and you arrive at scene. Now, we did have a very vigorous debate about using time that EMS arrives at the patient's site instead, because many of us did feel that this was actually a better reflection of the actual response time. And as Olivia pointed out, the curb to actually patient site time can be quite long, especially in an urban setting where you have high-rise buildings, like in my city, and the elevator goes up 50 floors, right? But we also recognize that in many EMS systems, they do not actually capture this time point very well. And it is quite subjective in the sense that, it's dependent on the recall of the paramedic, what time they actually arrive at the patient site, or if they turned on the defibrillator or some other proxy. So that is why we have given some flexibility that the system can define what is time point number 1 and time point number 2. And we think that this will give you better clarity when we are trying to compare apples and oranges or apples to apples.
Hussein has a question about cases transferred to another facility. This must be for you, Gavin, I'm thinking. Why not use transferred instead of unknown? I'm guessing that is for the patients that were transferred and we don't know what happened to them.
So, and I think, this was likely related to the, the backward, compatibility, with previous versions of Utstein. And I guess the transferred component, that if you know that the person has survived to discharge at the transferred facility, we would be wanting to capture, that as a survival outcome. And so, that was the main reason for not introducing an additional category.
And JT, I guess you want to respond to Steve Ball's question about agonal breathing?
Yeah, this is a good question he asked. I hope everyone can see it. The question is, how do you call it? Is it a bystander witness or not if someone walks or wakes up next to someone in agonal breathing or walks into a room where someone is in agonal breathing? So if you hear the agonal breathing from another room and walk in, I think this still fits the criteria of witnessed or seen or heard the cardiac arrest. If you come into a room and there's a person after what kind of time and what kind of minutes, then it's not witnessed by a bystander. So easy when you lay next to him, easy if you hear someone going down in the next room, then it's bystander witnessed or heard. If not, it's not bystander witnessed.
Okay, I think that's it, unless someone else wants to type in a quick question.
Janet, you said before, we have recorded that presentation, so people can also see that webinar, and we will share that the web link for the recorded presentation via all of our registries, right?
Correct, yeah. We will be, I'll circulate that once it's downloaded, and we may even be able to make it available perhaps on YouTube or something along those lines. Might be easiest. And yes, we can share the slides with the participants too. Oh, there is another one. What is the standard definition of the denominator when calculating survival rates? Great question. Because there's heterogeneity in this one. Well, Gavin, that's for you. Ziad, maybe you can respond to that one, given that it's probably a flowchart.
Yeah, so it's whatever the outcome is that you're obviously benchmarking, the denominator is the number of attempted resuscitations by EMS, which is defined in the template as the number of cardiac arrest attended in which dispatched responders perform chest compressions, defibrillations, or other related emergency care, or where a confirmed defibrillation occurs before EMS arrival.
Right. Thanks, Lee. That would have taken me a minute or two to locate in the document.
All right. Steve Ball, regarding do not attempt versus resuscitation attempts. So this is a DNR versus resus attempts. Can you clarify the rules around when resus is stopped, say, at the 15 mark of resus due to family wishes? Yeah, Gavin and I had a chat about this one last week.
And just seeking, I presume the 15 mark, that's 15 minutes. So you've done a 15-minute resuscitation attempt, and then you've decided to stop.
I mean, I guess it could be 15 seconds, but it is someone started compressions.
So I guess the 15-minute one, we'd covered, Janet, in our discussion that I think, we would count that as a resuscitation attempt. I think the 15-second one, if there was a do not attempt resuscitation decision, in place, and it was, during that initial, triage, I think at least when we discussed it, we said that we would have pulled that one out under the do not attempt resuscitation category.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, for most of us in our registries, we would consider that resuscitation attempted by EMS. I mean, 15 minutes of CPR and resuscitation.
Yeah, I would say the same. Certainly, from a more Australian context, that's the way that we would approach it. And I think it's also a different conversation to have between a do not attempt resuscitation order and family wishes. And so, family wishes usually comes about through discussion with the family around their preferences, the preferences of the family. But that often comes after 10, 20 minutes, even 30 minutes of resuscitation. And that's very different to a scenario where you've attempted resuscitation and there's been a delayed do not attempt a resuscitation order that's then been provided to the crew at the time. And so we might handle those two cases slightly differently.
Marcus, there's a time question in the Q&A. How would you?
So I'll just read out the question for those. The question is, how would you define time point 2 if the EM, I'm assuming the patient is transported or the EMS is transported via helicopter. So I think this is a little bit challenging because I would say that in most situations, I would assume your ground crew would respond first, and the helicopter is sort of like more of a secondary transport function, where they are the ALS arriving on scene, you would have BLS already working the patient. So usually the response time is defined by the first formal EMS on scene, which would usually be your BLS. In the rare situation where the helicopter is actually the first response, I would assume wheel stop turning, the equivalent will be at the time that you land, and if you can capture time at patient side, I think that's even better.
Gavin, there was a question about journals, publications using the Utstein template, and someone's noted a decline when they're reviewing journals, articles. As a editor for Resuscitation Plus, I actually haven't noticed that, Peter. I believe that it is still widely used in manuscripts, particularly publications coming from registries will cite it. It's probably more the single centre studies that may or may not use it, but they do still tend to follow, I guess, a format of it.
But Jenny, exactly that is what we discussed, when we changed some of the description and makes it a little bit easier. We have that checklist. And of course, we saw that when we screened that literature, that a lot of people published in a maybe not same way at the end, using the same variables, but maybe describing their data and their results another way. And we hope, I think, with that checklist and also with our template, to bring people more back to that idea of a reporting that is in the same way, like everyone is doing, and then add their special, as Siad said, add their definitions and their descriptions, what they want to have. So yes, I think we have a chance with the new Utstein definition and the new recommendations to get people more back on the track, that we will be able, on the global perspective, to combine and to share knowledge. Yep.
And I think, and sorry, I can't see the question, but I think there potentially has been a decline, or my reading of the literature is that it was being used less. But I wonder if that was the complexity in the 2015 version of that flowchart, and I think that was something that was specifically addressed in the in the 2015. I think people were struggling to get the relevant data to populate the tables, so therefore they were leaving the table out. But I think we continue to advocate as journal editors for the use of standardized reporting templates, and I guess many of the people on this call are actually the peer reviewers that will be reviewing registry type of work. So I'd encourage you, when undertaking the peer reviews, to call that out and to ask people to use the standardized templates, because that just helps with this whole concept about improving consistency and comparability between studies. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think we did state in the document too that we'd recommend that editors perhaps make the Utstein checklist available as part of the instructions to the authors. So we might need to have a chat about that, Gavin, and with Jerry to get that. Because, you know, most people will publish their resuscitation research in Resuscitation and Resuscitation Plus, so we can easily add it in there. Judith, did you have a question? Looks like you've got a question.
I'm just having a little online discussion here with the panel about a couple of the variables in terms of time have a different recommended time one. So for the one I talked about, the time to recognition of ILCOR by the dispatcher, the recommended time one is when EMS answers the phone, whereas the ones Marcus was talking about around response time, the recommended time one is what we're calling the public safety answering point number one, which is generally not the EMS. So I just wanted to check that that was intentional, I guess. That was just a little chat amongst ourselves. Like, is that what we really wanted? Or because I think the time to dispatch recognition of ILCOR is the only time, and don't quote me on this, I haven't been through it carefully, but I think it's the only time definition that is recommending the EMS, which is the PSAP2.
Yep. So I think Judith brings up an important point, and I want to bring us back to two core principles. So one is, what is the intent of the variable? And then number two, what is actually ideal versus what is feasible? So if we refer back to Judith's point about why are we collecting, for example, the time to dispatcher recognition of cardiac arrest. So that is actually looking at the performance of your EMS call center, right? Where you actually get the call and how long does it take for your dispatcher to recognize that it was actually a cardiac arrest and then start telephone instructions on CPR. And so I think it's perfectly reasonable to use the secondary PSAP time as the start, and then the time that dispatcher recognized the cardiac arrest as the time point 2, right? However, if you're talking about EMS response time, and that is actually looking at system performance, right? What time did a member of the public actually try to access the system, which is time of primary PSAP receiving the call, and then the time that it took for you to actually process the call, dispatch an ambulance navigates there, reach the scene, and that is your response time. You know, so I think the whole point is this, that for many years we were reporting response time as if it was a kind of standardized or very consistent variable. But the fact is that actually it is 2 time points, and each of them have their own definitions, and that affects very much the duration of that interval. So what we are trying to say is that please do report which time point you are actually collecting. And, you know, that should be something for registries to note, or for publications, you know, to note that when you report a response time, actually it is interval number 1, you know, time point 1 to time point 2, and what is time point 1 and what is time point 2.
Yeah, I think that's great, Marcus. It's sort of, but I just wanted people not to understand why that was the case, because otherwise they might think, well, why haven't you just been consistent throughout, which we haven't been, but for a logical reason.
Right, well, I think that is the hour. So thank you everyone for joining and for participating. Thank the panelists for your wonderful presentations and your work on this document, and hope to see you all at RES or at conferences sometime soon. Bye everyone.
Bye.